Today I'm going to cover how to make sampled funk. This is a style of funk that relies heavily on samples, so I'm going to be covering sampling tips, melody techniques, mixing concepts, and just a lot more. So let's get into it. As I mentioned when making these styles of beats, using samples is going to be central. We're trying to make that smooth style of funk, that old Memphis style, so I'm going to have to try to find the right sample to do this. And picking samples might be something that you struggle with, so let's cover some sample selection tips here. My thinking going in is that there are a few common types of instruments that show up in these types of beats, like pianos or electric pianos, as well as guitars. So I'm going to dig through genres that commonly have those types of sounds, which in this case could be jazz or soul. But this is where some additional knowledge can make a big difference. Using older 60s jazz samples, for example, might not be the best idea. Let me show you what I mean. If I look for jazz samples and I select a window that's past the late 70s, this can help me find jazz samples that have a bit more electronic instrumentation and modern processing effects on other instruments as well. So you can hear this jazz sample sounds far different than something like an older style of jazz. If I were to look at something in the 60s, the sounds and instruments in this older style are a lot more raw, far more acoustic. This might be a sample that fits better with a classic boom bap type of beat, which I also have tutorials on. But what I find helps for making these sampled funk beats is finding more modern, smooth, jazzy samples. In fact, it would probably be a good idea to even search by subgenre and look for the smooth jazz section. So this sounds great. As you can hear, we have some of those instruments that we're looking for, like guitars and electric pianos, and they have a lot of processing on them, which is exactly what I want. So let's go ahead and make a beat out of this. Now, before I chop the sample up, I do need to apologize in advance. My grandma is visiting right now, and she's sleeping upstairs, so we might need to be a bit more quiet. Anyways, let's start sampling. By the way, if you're watching this right now and you're a grandma, hit the like button. Leave a comment down below and let me know how many teeth you still have. So when listening to this sample, I think the beginning part here sounds great. I'm just going to use this as a starting point to see what I can find. Now, one thing that you might have noticed with these sampled funk beats is that they have a warmer feel to them. And so to help our beat have this same type of warm feel, let's go ahead and pitch this sample down 5 semitones, for example. And what this will do is bring the frequency presence of our entire sample down. And that way all of our sounds move towards that warmer, lower frequency area. So let's see what we have here. I think a good starting point for this sample would be to chop around the chords here and just build a very basic chord progression using these different chord chops. Now, this is a good starting point, but we can hear that we have a very similar chord later on in the sample. The thing is though, this one here is a bit more clean. You can hear with the one earlier, it starts to have a flute that comes in towards the end, and we also have that one pretty prominent guitar lick in there too. And that's not entirely a bad thing, but my plan is to layer my own sounds on top later, so picking a more clean chop that doesn't have as much instrumentation can help with that goal. Alright, next let's see what chord would work well with this one. Not that one. No. This one sounds pretty good to me. But the problem that we have here is that flute that comes in later on in this chop. I actually do like the way it sounds, it's cool, and it's something that we could definitely use, but I think having this play every 2 bars might make the beat a little bit too cluttered. Again, I want to find more basic chops at first, so let's see if we can find this exact same chord elsewhere in the sample, but maybe one that's a bit more basic with less instruments on it. Alright, so that's unfortunate. It looks like the sample doesn't show up anywhere else and just gets more and more full at this point. So what I'm gonna have to do is use this chop that has instrumentation all over it. But let's get creative here. I'm gonna try to figure out a way to get this to actually work. First, let's try to take that beginning part of this chord. And I'm gonna try to extend this. Before that flute starts playing, what I'm gonna do is place another chop right before it. And now what I'm gonna do is use the reverse function. So now this chop plays that same beginning area, but in reverse. And I'll also slow this chop way down. Then by piecing both of these chops together, I create one long extended chord. I now have a cleaner chord that I can use instead of the one that has the flutes come in. I think this is a good starting point. You can hear it feels a bit disjointed, especially when you get to this part of these chops. We do have that small little imperfection, but once we add other sounds on top, it should get masked. So far we have a simple 2-chord progression here, but like I mentioned, I actually do like the idea of that flute that does come in later on in this chop. Having it play every 2 bars would be a bit too much, I think, but every 4 bars would be fine. So I'm gonna duplicate this pattern out, and for the 4th bar here, I'm just gonna use that longer chop so that flute starts to play. So we do have a problem here. That chop isn't long enough. The flute sort of gets cut off at the end here, but this is a simple fix. I'm just gonna stretch this chop until we reach the point where the chop ends at that perfect time. All right, perfect. So here is our full loop. Now before I add my drums and stuff to mask the imperfections in this loop, I'm gonna do some processing on this sample. First I'm gonna add some Saturn on. This is partly to get the sample louder, but also do this in a way where we get some slight saturation that gets added, again, in order to create a bit of that warmth. I'm also gonna use an EQ here, primarily to get rid of that low end. My plan is to add my own 808 into this beat, so let's get that bass from the sample out of the way. And I also like the percussion in this sample in the higher end here. I think it's a cool way to bring presence into the high end of the beat, so I just wanted to emphasize that a little bit more. Speaking of adding bass into the beat, I'm gonna go ahead and create my 808 pattern. Let's first grab an 808 here. I don't want an 808 that has too much distortion. I think using an 808 like this one here, that's a bit more clean, will help with that smooth feeling of this beat that I'm trying to create. And here for my pattern, I'm just gonna create something that closely follows the progression of my sample. Again, the sample's a 2-chord progression, so let's create a 2-note progression with my 808 pattern. And I'll add in a few additional notes just to add a little bit more musicality here. All right, I think this is sounding good to me.
This goddamn kid.
Oh, I think I need to be a bit more quiet. All right, so let's move on to adding some more sounds into this beat. Like I mentioned earlier, guitars and pianos are pretty common, so let's go ahead and add some of those in. I think this piano here might work. It does need a little bit more processing though. For me, it's a bit too colorful for my liking, kind of cheesy sounding. So first I'm gonna add some EQ to get rid of some of that color. And I think the sound would be better suited if it was just in the background a little bit more in the beat, so throwing on some reverb might be a good idea. Now for the pattern itself, I don't need to create something that's extremely melodically complex or anything. I'm just going to use this to fill up the pocket in this beat that's a bit more open right now. So I think this does a good job of exactly what I want it to do. I do want to layer something else in though. I think a guitar playing alongside this piano might sound good, and it might fill up a bit more space in the beat and maybe give it a bit more presence. So this jazz guitar here doesn't sound all that great really. It doesn't really fit with that modern jazz aesthetic. So let's go ahead and add some effects onto it to help it fit better. So first, I think cutting a bit of the lower end of this guitar would be a good idea and emphasizing the more colorful part. Basically what I'm doing here is the opposite of what I did with my piano, just to help fill up the beat a bit more. Also, I'm going to play with the preset directly right here and control the timbre. I feel like this will help bring a little bit more color out of this guitar as well. I probably should have done this before I went with my EQ. Going directly into the sound itself and changing its actual characteristics within the plugin can have a very drastic effect on your sounds. This is something that I talked about in my video on how to pretty much use any plugin. If you use a plugin and get confused by a lot of the doodads and gizmos in it, check that video out. So as of right now, this guitar is sounding a bit better to me, but I think using a flanger would be a really big game changer here. Alright, now to me this guitar is sounding like it fits with that 80s jazz style, which is the sort of motif I'm trying to go for here. Next, I'm going to build a pattern with this guitar. I'm going to have to be a little bit more detailed with what I do here. This is something that I mentioned in an older video about the most important sounds to use in your beats. When using guitars, there are just a lot of small details to pay attention to in order to get this to sound good and actually natural. First, I'm just going to create a very simple pattern that follows my piano. I'm more so using this as a means of layering rather than creating an entirely new melody here. So this sounds okay, but I do want this to sound more realistic. So playing around with note velocity and note length will be important. For this first note right here, I almost want this to sound like a ghost note, so I'm going to turn down the velocity here. I'm also going to shorten the length of this note as well. I'm also going to push it slightly off grid and closer to this next note. I think even when these notes' velocities are really low, it still feels a bit too audible for my liking. Again, I want to create almost a ghost note feel. So I'm going to go into my channel controls down here and just really control the volume to make those initial notes sound less loud. At this point, I do think this guitar needs a bit more body. It feels a bit weak and thin. I might have adjusted the characteristic of the sound a bit too much with my EQ and timbre adjustments. But instead of going back and changing those settings, what I think might be a good solution is to just duplicate this pattern out and bring this an octave down. Now this fills up a bit more space. Let's hear how this sounds now. Alright, this sounds good. I'm happy where this is going. Let's go ahead and add in the drum pattern. I'm just going to create something very simple and straightforward here. Alright, so we have the bare bones of our beat here. Let's use the usual funk techniques for the hook. I'm going to grab a vocal sample and create a simple vocal loop. This is something that I showed you in my last funk video. So if you haven't seen it, there are some more valuable lessons in that video that apply, like why I'm making my drum patterns so simple and why that makes sense for these types of beats. Anyways, let's go ahead and create a vocal loop. And to really reinforce this jazzy aesthetic, I think layering in something more jazzy alongside this vocal sample could really help. So I'm gonna go ahead and duplicate my original sample and see what other jazziness I can find in here. I think taking that little loop there and running it through an EQ to really strip it down would make it fit a lot better. And there we go, I think this sounds good.
I've had enough of this kid. It's ass whooping time.
This beat's sounding real smooth, real clean, and I'm loving it so far. I'm gonna go ahead and play the full beat for you, but... Wait, who's there?
You stupid kid, I'm trying to sleep.
Grandma, be careful, this beat's really smooth. You're gonna slip. Oh no! Oh, Grandma, you idiot. Anyways, here's a full beat for you. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe. If you want to check out another video, it's right in the corner, and head over to betterbeatmaker.com. If you want to check out my full online beatmaking course, and if you want to join my producer community, the link is in the description below, as well as a link to my free drum kit. Anyways, here's a full beat.